Hello, everyone. Welcome to the July meeting of Citizens Climate Lobby. I'm Flannery Winchester, CCL's Senior Director of Communications, and I will be your host today. So please go ahead and introduce yourself in the Q&A so that we can all see it and welcome each other. Let us know where you're joining from and how many folks are there with you. Also, we're going to drop a link in the chat where you can log your attendance today so that we officially know you were here. That really helps us track our progress and measure our impact when you log your attendance, so please do take a second to do that. Just make sure you're logged into CCL Community and then click that link. So right at the top of the meeting here, I want to say welcome to our chapters who are newly active or who held climate advocate training workshops this month. So welcome to our Milton chapter in Canada and Mount Washington Valley chapter in New Hampshire. Thank you guys for being on the call with us this month. All right, so let's get started. So we're at an interesting moment in the year. We're halfway through the calendar year where we've seen actually an exciting amount of legislative movement on climate bills that we're supporting. And of course, we've just come off of our summer conference and lobby day. And now we're seeing political momentum is turning toward campaign season in earnest as lawmakers look ahead to the election in November. So on today's call, we have CCL's Vice President of Government Affairs, Ben Pendergrass, here as our guest to help us understand the impact that we made on Capitol Hill last month and where things stand in general right now with legislation that CCL is interested in. And we'll also touch on what we might expect from Congress in the coming months. And then, as always, today during the meeting, we'll talk through this month's action sheet and what you and your chapters can be working on in the next few weeks. So before we get into all of that, let's take a few minutes to celebrate some of our recent successes. So please go ahead and share any of your individual CCL wins or chapter successes in the Q&A so that they're visible to everyone. And in particular, those of you who were in DC, if you want to share any fun moments or memories that you have from the conference and lobby day, drop those in the Q&A as well. And I will read some of those. I'll read some of those out loud after I share our national highlights. So at the national level, we are, of course, celebrating that we had our biggest annual showing, our summer conference and lobby day in DC just a few weeks ago. So we had 991 confirmed attendees who came from all 50 states and DC, and 195 of those folks were students. So a very strong showing from our youth CCLers this year. We loved having y'all. Huge shout out also to the attendees who came through our inclusion and conservative scholarships. So we were able to help 13 conservative volunteers attend and 19 BIPOC volunteers attend through those scholarship programs. And during the conference, we trained up a whopping 245 new folks in our climate advocate and lobby training. And all the stats aside, I'll just say it was so fabulous, as always, to be together in DC, to get to hear incredible speakers and panels alongside each other. There's always such great energy at our DC events, so I know I enjoyed it, and I hope you all did too. And of course, as part of that event, we brought that energy to Capitol Hill too. So another huge highlight that we're celebrating from the last month is that we had 442 meetings in person on our lobby day. So our primary asks were about permitting reform and the Prove It Act. And all of those meetings that we had were supported by 1,870 calls to Congress about the Prove It Act. So Congress actually heard from us in person and on the phones from all around the country. And we're also celebrating all of the impact that our lobby day made. So we have seen more co-sponsors sign on to bills. We've seen some bills move forward. So we're going to dive into all of that with Ben in just a few minutes. Last but not least, another highlight from this last month is that we officially welcomed Rachel Carestas as CCL's new executive director. So if you weren't able to join us on our July 2nd meet and greet call that we held with Rachel and CCL volunteers, definitely check that out on CCL's YouTube channel. We had a great evening sharing volunteer stories and hearing about Rachel's early priorities, her thoughts on bipartisanship, and lots more. So that's a bit of what we are celebrating at the national level. And let me turn now to the Q&A and see what you guys are celebrating locally. So I see Steve from Ohio is saying that his chapter completed 250 postcards in support of climate/environmental voters. Fantastic. George in Anchorage says 10 people showed up for our latest EVP postcarding party. Awesome. Another Steve says 7 people did 100 postcards on Monday night in Ohio. All right, so y'all are hustling on the postcards to environmental voters. That's fantastic. Um, in Raritan Valley in New Jersey says we had 9 people from our chapter attend the DC conference, including a high school student and a college student. Awesome. Madison, Wisconsin, they had 6 youth from the Madison chapter attend the conference in DC. Let's see. Jean says it was great in our lobby meeting when our member of Congress's aide said she would be sure that the member of Congress would see our trusted messenger letter. Fantastic. So that was an action that we gave you guys before the conference and said, bring in a letter from a trusted messenger in the community, bring that to show that to your member of Congress and help, lay the groundwork for a positive meeting. And so Jean says they brought their letter and that went over well. Fantastic. All right. Well, so we could keep going. But there are I'm glad to hear there are lots of successes out there in the field that you guys are celebrating. Thank you for sharing all of that. All right, so we are now going to dig in a little bit more into the impact that we've made since that lobby day and where things stand legislatively overall at this point in the year. So to help us make sense of everything, I'd like to welcome Ben Pendergrass, our VP of Government Affairs, to the call for a Q&A. So we're going to have a conversation first, and then we'll have time for your questions too. So Ben, hi Ben, happy Saturday.
How's it going, Flannery?
Good.
Having a good weekend?
I sure am. I'm in no better place to be than right here with you.
Absolutely.
All right. So you have been continuing to have meetings on the Hill since all of our volunteers were there on June 11th. And so I'm curious, what kind of impact can you tell that it made on members of Congress and their staff for us to have so many meetings, to be there with so many volunteers from all over the country? What are you hearing after our lobby day?
Well, I certainly always hear the impression that the volunteers filling all the halls and all the cafeterias and all the places always makes on not just members, but also on other organizations as they try to move through the halls of Congress, and we're taking up all the space. So we definitely are physically, we always make an impression when we come up to DC. That is a given. But one thing we are hearing a lot of is, one of the things we really wanted to deliver was that message that we're not done with permitting reform. Obviously, there's no bill that you can add co-sponsors to, so we can't measure success in some of those normal ways like that. But we've definitely heard that message that permitting reform is not done was well received. Members need to hear that. And even if we don't move forward on a big package this year, even though I do think there's an opportunity in the lame duck for that, that message has been gotten, and we will keep on this permitting reform trajectory until it is done.
Awesome. Okay, so yeah, let's talk about each of our primary asks. So when we had these 442 meetings, we had 2 main asks we were talking to Congress about. So one was that idea to finish the job on permitting reform. And then, so what else can you tell us? It sounds like you said we're still pushing on that. There's maybe potential in the lame duck. But what other movement have we seen on permitting reform related things lately?
Not so much on well, we did see something on permitting reform, which between our June lobby day now was the Advance Act was signed into law. That is a nuclear kind of a permitting reform bill, but it also touches on a lot of things to just help advance nuclear, get its footing, keep the current fleet operating. I mean, it's very important since that is our largest source of non-emissive power in the country. And so that was a huge bipartisan win that just was signed by the president. I think it was actually last week when he finally signed it. It passed the Senate a few weeks before, and an 88-2 vote. Extremely bipartisan. You don't get more bipartisan than that. And our volunteers directly lobbied on that bill during the conservative conference back in March. And we kind of wrapped that in because if you remember on that ask sheet around permitting reform, we specifically mentioned the need for technology-specific permitting reform that include things like for nuclear, for hydropower, for geothermal. And so this was a really big bipartisan win for nuclear power.
Awesome. Yeah. So the way a simple way we can think about the permitting reform push is basically we're trying to make it easier and faster to deploy clean energy all around the country. And so this bill was one way to help advance.
A- Advanced nuclear power. It's great.
Yeah, another form of energy that does not emit carbon pollution. Great. Well, that's great to hear that passed, and of course we've shared that in the newsletter and stuff. But good to voice that out loud here, and especially how bipartisan the vote was. That's always encouraging to see.
I mean, and if you look back at the Senate vote previously, and in the House, it was a overwhelming bipartisan vote in the House, and so it's been a process that's played out over the last year or so, I think it's a really good example of that Congress can work in a bipartisan manner. They can come together, they can pass bills that are important to clean energy, and they can still get this stuff done even in this year where there's a lot of fights happening. There was a lot of drama with the speakership and all these different things, and yet they're still able to come together and advance this bill.
Yeah, that's great to see. Okay, so that was one of the primary asks, was the permitting reform push, and some progress we've seen there. And then our other primary ask was about the Prove It Act. So for those on the call who want a little refresher, that's the bill that would direct the Department of Energy to measure the carbon intensity of a range of goods manufactured at home and abroad. And the bill has already been introduced in the Senate, and it has passed out of committee in the Senate. But then there was more huge progress on it just this week. So Ben, can you tell us what's up with the Prove It Act?
Yeah, no, it was very exciting. I think you know, we knew there was an effort. Well, I mean, we were working on the effort to get a House version of the Prove It Act introduced. We knew that Congressman John Curtis and Scott Peters were going to be the lead sponsors, but we wanted to continue to push the House to get that bill actually introduced and get it introduced with a good lineup of bipartisan co-sponsors. And that finally happened this week on Tuesday. Congressman Peters and Curtis introduced the bill with 10 Republicans and 10 Democrats. That's a pretty good bipartisan ratio and a good showing for any bill to get introduced with 20 original co-sponsors. So we're very pleased to see that get out the door. And it, of course, has jump-started the conversation around the Prove It Act again, which we really wanted to see. And one of the things I wanted to really highlight is there has been really organized, well-funded opposition to the Prove It Act. That is one reason it has been kind of delayed. And so I think we really acted as a really strong counterweight to some of that opposition in our meetings in June when we were hitting almost every House office and delivering that message about why it's so timely and needed. And I think that's very helpful. I mean, our voice was able to add to some of our allies who have also been working on the Prove It Act. And so I think it was great that we had our June lobby day just in a really timely fashion to get the Prove It Act out the door.
Absolutely. Okay, well that's it's not great to hear that there was well-funded opposition, but it is great to hear that we were there to counteract that. I mean, that's our whole thing, right? The voice of regular people coming to Congress and saying, "Hey, we want this, we want action here. We need this problem to be addressed. So please listen to us." So that's wonderful.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think in this is another instance where we had an impact that I don't think is completely measured in just co-sponsors. I know hearing from other organizations and talking to people, our meetings in the Senate did have an impact. Members have been talking about that, they heard from CCL members and it really made an impression on them around the Prove It Act and that they were taking a harder look at the bill and thinking about co-sponsorship. So sometimes it's not immediate gratification, but even on the Senate side, though we haven't seen any new co-sponsors pop up, our voice was definitely heard on that side of the aisle as well.
That's great to hear. Okay, well, so those were our two main primary asks, permitting and the Prove It Act, but we also had a couple of secondary asks. So let's check in on those. And actually, before I ask you about these updates, let me just say, if anybody on the call is wondering, as I say these bill names and you're going, what is that bill? Like, give me the details on that bill. Don't forget, you can find all of our lobbying asks, our training videos explaining all of this in depth on CCL Community. So if you hear these phrases and you want to go deeper, CCL Community is the place to go. So one of our secondary asks was the Increased TSP Access Act. So what movement have we seen from our engagement there?
So we did see 6 new co-sponsors from the volunteers' efforts on that bill. I think it's actually kind of cool. So that brings us to exactly 30 Republicans and 30 Democrats. So that's really, we like to see those equal bipartisan numbers. That's great. And so that brought us up there. And I should note that all our efforts throughout the year on the TSP Access Act have really paid off, because both the House version of the Farm Bill, the House Republican version of the Farm Bill, and the Senate Republican version of the Farm Bill have now both included the TSP Access Act in their underlying text. And so that was always the goal. A lot of these bills we've worked on around healthy forests, the play was always to get them in the Farm Bill, and adding co-sponsors helps them do that. It shows that they have a lot of support, and so it makes the committees want to add those bills in there. I mean, there's still, you want to keep adding support to it so they stay in the final version, but in itself, those were two major victories, and make it much more likely whenever Congress does finally advance a reauthorized farm bill that the TSP Access Act will be part of that.
Got it. Okay, that's great to know. Yeah, it's I think for those of us who are not where you are, which is on the Hill all the time, thinking about Congress all the time, it's easy to hear a bill name and think, okay, this bill is just going to go through the process. But often what happens is a bill gets packaged up with other things and it moves as part of a big package of legislation. So that's what I'm hearing you saying about the increased TSP Access Act, is that it's part of, we hope is part of the eventual farm bill. And so far it's been included in drafts.
Absolutely, and I think this one thing, I don't know if we need to make a new version of that, like Schoolhouse Rock, how a bill becomes a law, because a bill rarely becomes a law like it did 30 years ago. I mean, everything is usually put into various packages that are moving, whether or not it's an omnibus bill or part of something else that's moving, like the National Defense Authorization Act or the Farm Bill. This is just the way you do things, but you still want to get co-sponsors to make it more likely that they do get inserted into these packages.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, I wouldn't say no to a new cartoon about how all that works. Okay, so our next secondary ask was the Seedlings for Sustainable Future Act. So what movement have we seen on that bill?
So we added 4 co-sponsors there. There were no co-sponsors on the bill and on the House side until, we made that push. And I mean, it really is, the seedlings bill really is important for reforestry supply chains, and so we're trying to highlight that. One of my favorite stories of the conference was, we actually, I think Jen and I got an email from the lead sponsor of the bill within 30 minutes of a volunteer group meeting with an office that became a co-sponsor. Like, it happened that fast. The morning of, the office immediately, once the volunteers met with them, emailed the lead sponsor and said, we want to get on this bill. So that was extremely immediate gratification when it came to that. And so that was just a fun little anecdote from the conference.
That's awesome.
And I will say, we still expect to add some co-sponsors. There's always a lot going on in DC. There's been some recesses. I expect we will add some more folks to these bills. But I will also say, like, sometimes we get like a lot more. You might remember from previous conferences, sometimes we might get as many as 20 or 30 new co-sponsors after a lobby day. But in reviewing the meeting notes, I know Prove It and permitting took up a lot of time and most of the meetings, and we kind of warned people that might not have a chance to get to secondary asks in a lot of meetings. And that actually really was the case, that a lot of meetings did not have time to get to some of the secondary asks, and that's fine. But that would be one of the reasons I think we're seeing a slightly lower number of post-conference co-sponsors on secondary asks.
Got it. Okay, that makes sense. All right, so those were all our asks for the lobby day. And I know, Ben, we had planned to go through our whole conversation and then take audience questions, but I think it actually might make sense to take some questions now from folks who are on the call, clarifying some of what we just talked through. Is that all right if we shake it up?
Sounds good.
Okay. So I'm seeing a bunch of questions in the Q&A where people are asking if you could say a little bit more about the opposition to the Prove It Act. So can you just explain a little bit more about what's going on there?
No, it is very interesting, because on at its simplest level, the Prove It Act is just a report. It shouldn't be that scary. I think it creates a great deal of value, because we need our own data, just like we talked about, for like when we're dealing with trading partners. We need that data. We need it to be our own data. We don't want to like count on the EU's data. But it's also a really good coalition building vehicle to bring Republicans and Democrats together to talk about climate and trade and advance it. And there's actually been a pretty broad coalition in support of the Prove It Act that includes not only like climate advocacy groups like us in Climate Leadership Council, but also industry. The Chamber of Commerce supports it, the American Petroleum Institute, the Steel Institute. A lot of American industry knows or believes they are cleaner than some of their global competitors, and they want to use the Prove It Act to prove it. And so there is this really strong coalition support, but there's also folks that seem very scared of what the Prove It Act could either surface around emissions or a step towards greater climate action. And so they really have stepped up and have even launched ad campaigns against some members that were considering being co-sponsors of the Prove It Act, and have just, for a bill that is a report, there has been a lot more opposition and action than you would expect. And in my world, if somebody is opposing something that hard, who are maybe not the best actors when it comes to climate, I think we're on the right track. It just makes it, to my mind, that makes it even more important that we continue to push Prove It Act forward and get it over the finish line. Because yeah, if people are opening their wallets, they're that scared, I think we're on to something here.
For sure. Okay, we have one question about if someone's member of Congress has not yet supported the Prove It Act, should this be a priority in their lobby efforts this summer? So do you maybe want to talk a little bit about like how liaisons are reaching out, or kind of what our positioning is right now?
Yeah, so one of the things, I mean, a lot of offices, they say like, let us know when a bill gets introduced. They're not necessarily, bill it's a real priority to be an original co-sponsor, which means you're on the bill, before, when it's introduced. They're happy to add their name later. So the liaisons have been following up with their offices to let them know that the bill has been introduced, and doing that follow up to say, like, if you're interested, please take this opportunity to take a second look at the bill and potentially become a co-sponsor. So for right now, that's what we're looking at. We might do some further actions on Prove It, but right now that is the primary action that we're doing, is just that follow up. Since we just had those lobby meetings, we don't want to inundate offices immediately with any more meeting requests or things like that. And also, this is, the time of the summer where they're going on recess again, and there's the Republican National Convention next week and things like that. So we did that this week. Should be all officers should be aware that it has been introduced, but stay tuned. We might have further actions when they get back.
Got it. Okay. Well, that's a nice segue into, I'll go back into some of our planned questions, because I wanted to, after Lobby Day, kind of zoom out a little bit to talk about what's coming next, really, for the rest of the year. So obviously we're halfway through the year, and as you said, there's some things coming up, not the least of which is election season is starting to ramp up. I don't know if you've noticed, there's been some chatter, there's been some headlines, just some stuff going on. But so what does that mean for the pace of work in Congress, for what Congress is focused on over the next couple of months?
That's a really good question, Planner, and a good point. And I think it's good for everybody to be aware. We've taken a lot of action, and we'll obviously are going to continue to do things and push Congress. But this is kind of the congressional doldrums kind of period that we start to enter. They're in a recess for a week because of the convention. They come back, they'll do like a couple quick things. Don't expect like a lot of legislative action, and then we have the August recess, which they really want to take advantage of the August recess because obviously it is a campaign season. So don't expect a lot of movement or seeing bills get introduced. And then they come back, they'll have to do some must-pass things. They'll have to extend the farm bill. They'll have to do some sort of funding extension for the government. And I mean, they sometimes talk about having greater ambition, but I'm going to keep the bar pretty low. I think they'll probably do the things they just absolutely have to get done, and then they're back on the campaign trail, and it's kind of a sprint to the election. But then we usually see a flurry of the activity in the lame duck portion of Congress, which is after the election. That's when they really come back and try to like tie up loose ends. So we'll kind of have this period of 3 months where you don't see a lot of things advance. You're not going to see like a lot of votes on the things we're working on. We probably won't see like a big permitting reform package get introduced. But then in that lame duck portion at the very end of the year, we could see some things move, and we typically have seen a lot of stuff. That's where things get put onto packages. That's where we hope to see the Prove It Act be attached to a moving vehicle, most likely the National Defense Authorization Act. And that's when we will really have to gear up. And luckily, we just happen to have a virtual lobby day planned during that time of year. So that's when we will swing into action once more.
Okay. Okay. So let me make sure I got all that. So not a whole lot of movement from Congress here in the next stretch because they are so focused on the campaign. There's all, other things going on. But after the election, that's the lame duck period, and that's where we can see some movement. So let me ask then, what does that mean for our volunteers in terms of their the message we're trying to send to Congress in the next few months? So, because obviously on the program side of CCL, we have a lot of election engagement opportunities. We have chances for people to be sending postcards to voters and to be phone banking to voters and trying to, turn voters out. But as far as, sending a message to Congress or being in front of members of Congress or candidates, what does that look like during campaign season?
No, I mean, it's an awesome opportunity. I mean, they're all going to be home. They're going to be back in the state and district. So it's really a good opportunity to show up to things like candidate forums, town halls, raise questions about the importance of climate, push some of these things, talk about the need for permitting reform, all those opportunities. And just because we don't see movement or there might not be a hearing or something happening in Congress, it's still a great time to send a message on some of this stuff. I mean, certainly continue to check on our action sheet what's going on. We will continue to do things like the Climate Action Program to get calls and emails going to offices, and all that stuff, does pay dividends when we get to the lame duck. And so we're certainly going to keep working on all these avenues.
Awesome. Okay. And so just an election question that I imagine is on the minds of our folks. What happens if the member of Congress who wins in someone's particular area or other elected officials, win power in November who maybe aren't as favorable to climate action as we would hope? How are you thinking about our advocacy in that kind of context?
Well, that's really our job, right? It's to change hearts and minds and bring them further along the line to being climate advocates. I've really been struck. Obviously, Congressman Curtis has been out talking a lot about the Prove It Act and everything he's worked on in the Conservative Climate Caucus the last couple of days, because he just did introduce that. And something he said the other day really struck me, that when he joined Congress just a few terms ago, he had no idea that climate would become such a focus of his congressional career. It never even occurred to him. And a lot of his shift towards founding the caucus, taking a leadership role on the Prove It Act, moving over to the Senate and looking what his role is going to be in the Senate. And he clearly sees a role for him in the Senate to work on climate stuff. That was all because of constituent advocacy. He will credit CCL volunteers for really pushing him at town halls and other venues to make climate a priority. And he realized that Republicans have to have a better answer when their constituents ask these questions. So that is, I think, the clearest example of, you might look at a incoming candidate and be like, well, he doesn't care about the climate. We can make him.
Love that. Love that. Okay. And then you mentioned this in one of your answers a few minutes ago, but just to make sure that people caught this, we will be lobbying again later this year, correct?
Oh yes, most
Okay.
certainly.
All right.
Even though there will be members that will be, quote, lame ducks because they will have lost election or retiring, they still can vote. Congress will still have a lot of stuff to do. So I think it's in December this year. December lobby day will be just as important as ever.
Awesome. All right. So yeah, stay tuned, folks. There's always another upcoming opportunity to keep pushing Congress. All right, well, so let me take another look at the questions here. We've got a few minutes before we wrap up. Let's see if there's anything else people are wondering about since we've got you. Oh, okay, we do have a question asking, so this is in the permitting reform section of our advocacy. Somebody's asking for an update on big wires.
It's all still in the mix. I think a minimum transfer requirement is still very much a part of probably any possibility of getting into any package. I mean, we haven't seen any movement on big wire specifically, but we're kind of considering it as part of the whole broader reform. And one thing, going back to the June push, just as a reminder, one of the things we really thought was important post a lot of FERC rules, a lot of CEQ rules, the debt ceiling deal, just reminding offices that Congress needs to still take action. That was the message we were most focused on, because there is a tendency in Congress to say, well, this is done, we don't need to address it anymore. And we really wanted to counteract that message, and I think we were very successful. And now I think we're seeing this other places where almost everybody universally now also agrees that yes, Congress is not done with permanent reform. There's a lot that needs to be done. But that was the main message, not so much about the specific parts of a package, but stay tuned. We might be returning to that at some point in the future. But we're still pushing the broader, just big message on permitting.
Gotcha. Okay. And I have a couple questions here about the House version of the Prove It Act versus the Senate version of the Prove It Act. Are they the same, or are there major differences, or would they have to reconcile between them if they pass both chambers?
There are some slight differences that, for some reason, the House and Senate always just have to do things slightly different. I think the biggest difference, because the Senate bill was slightly amended when it moved out of the EPW committee to match what was probably going to be introduced in the House a little bit more. But I believe the only substantial difference in the House version is there is a not just look at environmental standards and carbon content. I think there's a human rights portion of the bill that was not in the Senate version, but they're largely like universally like 96% similar. There's no major changes that would make give us any heartburn at all, and it's likely the way Prove It Act will advance as being tacked onto a bill, most likely in the Senate, that you really would need to have a reconciliation process where each bill advances as standalone bills and then they have to be reconciled. It will probably be one version of the bill that advances as an amendment to a larger bill.
Gotcha. Okay. And we can take just a couple more minutes for this last question. So I have a question here from Jeffrey, who I think rightfully asks, will we ever get back to pushing fee and dividend? So I'll just say we're never not pushing carbon fee and dividend. We love it. We are always committed to it. But I'm sure he's seeing the recent asks and seeing that it was not a primary focus on the lobby day. And so I wonder if maybe you can say anything about maybe the landscape around carbon pricing next year, things that we're kind of looking at slightly longer term that might bring that more into the forefront of the policy discussion.
Yeah, Faye, it's something, I mean, as you said, it's always a priority. It's like one of our 4 priority areas. It's just sometimes you work on one thing with a little bit more intensity because it's right in front of you, and sometimes you continue to lay the groundwork for other longer term policies. And one thing that we're really looking ahead to is the tax debate that's going to happen about the expiring 2017 tax cuts. That we really see as the next opportunity to really push and talk more about a carbon price. All that is very dependent upon election outcomes and how Congress might be looking at that process. But we think that will be an excellent opportunity to highlight that you're going to need to think about how we raise revenue in that debate, and a carbon price could be something that is very attractive to some members of Congress and can kind of give it a boost. Obviously, right now in the Congress we have that's divided, there's really no opportunity to advance a carbon price in the near future, but it is something that we will continue to discuss, and we will probably look for other opportunities to highlight the effectiveness of a carbon price before the end of the year.
Awesome.
And I will say, we did just take an action because we did have some new studies about a carbon price on top of an IRA that came out just a few months ago. And one of our actions, I believe, Flannery, you probably know better than me sometimes, in May was to highlight that for offices, to email them these new studies on a carbon price and just make sure that all congressional offices were aware.
Yeah, absolutely. That was a recent action. Let me see if I've got the number right here at my fingertips. We did share, let's see. Um, we did share that message with Congress. Oh no, I don't have the final number at my fingertips, but it was our May action, was reaching out about that research and making sure Congress knows, hey, even the latest studies are showing that in this policy landscape, a carbon price is still one of the most powerful and most effective things you can do to layer on and get us closer to our emissions reduction goals. So awesome. All right. Well, thank you, Ben. That is all the time that we have for questions. But I know I appreciate, and I think the people on the call appreciate your insights and helping us make sense of all this. So thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Flannery. Hope everyone enjoys their weekend.
All right. And for other folks on the call, if you continue to have questions about anything that Ben shared, or you think about the stuff, digest it a little more, and you have questions later, our Lobbying Congress forum on CCL Community is the perfect place to go, because staff monitors those forums. We can continue this conversation there, and give you all the information and answers that you need to keep going with your advocacy. All right, so now let's take a look at our July action sheet for actions that you can be working on this month. So first up, we have a media action, which is to use one of our timely topics to write a climate-focused letter to the editor. So millions of people around the country have been dealing with very high temperatures in recent weeks. You might be one of them. And that will continue. So this is really top of mind in a lot of areas of the country. So take this chance to write a letter to your local newspaper about how these summer weather extremes are affecting you. They're affecting the people you care about. You could even write about how the heat is affecting your cost of living or the cost of doing business, things like that. So it's a really compelling opportunity to make the case for what we're seeing, connect the dots to climate change, and then push for climate action. Another topic that's on people's minds is the upcoming election. So you could write letters that communicate to members of Congress and to challenging candidates that climate is a priority issue for constituents like you. So these writing ideas and more are available on our July action sheet. Next up, our big mobilization action this month is to email Congress about permitting reform. So as we just talked about with Ben, that was one of our primary asks last month on Capitol Hill. We've seen that movement with the Advance Act, but there is still more to be done. So even as we head into the height of campaign season, it's super important that we keep laying this groundwork, keep showing Congress that there's demand for this, so that as soon as there's an opening, they can move forward. Our goal is to send 10,000 messages. So grab the link from the action sheet and send your messages. And the action sheet also has a communication exercise for you to practice talking about why we need permitting reform and what we're pushing for. And another action that you can take this month is an election-related action. So your incumbent members of Congress and candidates will all likely be campaigning in your district or state in July and August. So they're going to be holding candidate forums and town halls. And these types of events are really a good opportunity for you to connect with all candidates on the issue of climate change. So we have training resources listed on the action sheet about how to get your chapter involved in finding these events, attending the events, crafting good questions to ask at the events, and all of that. So definitely check that out. And then last but not least, we have a bonus action for you to actually help mobilize environmental voters. So as you've probably heard over the last few months, we partner with our friends over at the Environmental Voter Project to host weekly phone banks for CCL volunteers to call environmental voters and encourage them to vote. So we also have opportunities for postcarding if you would rather write postcards to prospective voters. And we have more ways to get involved through our election engagement action team. So if you're starting to pay more attention to the upcoming election and you want to make sure that folks who care about the climate, care about the environment are actually turning out to vote, then definitely check out those opportunities and details on the July action sheet. All right, so that's everything that we've got for you today. Just as a quick reminder, please do log your attendance to let us know you were here today for our July meeting. So there's a link on the screen there and a QR code that you can scan. But that's it. That's July. Thanks again, everyone, for being here for this month's meeting.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Citizens Climate Lobby's training program. You can tune into more episodes anywhere podcasts are available. Inspired by what you heard today? Join Citizens Climate Lobby to advocate for bipartisan climate solutions. Go to community.citizensclimate.org to find more trainings, resources, your local chapter, national action teams, discussion forums, and more. Be sure to like our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and Instagram @CitizensClimate. We also invite all of our listeners to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiration.
Like what you hear? Recommend us to your friends and make sure to give us a 5-star rating. It helps us show up on other listeners' feeds. Feel free to pass on any suggestions for future episodes in the comments as well.
And together, we are creating the political will for a livable world.